Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, as Sudan's warring sides agree to yet another tenuous ceasefire, UN rejects Khartoum's declaration of the organization's envoy as persona non grata. Sudan's military chief accuses German Volker Perthes of being partisan, but the diplomat will continue to do his job from Kenya. Also, the World Food Programme joins the US in suspending food aid to Ethiopia after massive theft of previous donations. The halting of supplies will affect millions still recovering from 2 years of war. And a Mozambican ruby dazzles at auction in New York, setting a new record price of $34.8 million. The 55.22 carat gem is the largest of its kind to ever go under the hammer. But first, the UN said that Sudan can't declare the organisation's envoy to the country persona non grata. Amidst an ongoing war between two rival generals, Khartoum's foreign ministry demanded that the UN remove Volker Perthes from his post. The UN says that he'll continue to do his job from Kenya. Meanwhile, both sides in the devastating Sudanese conflict have agreed to another truce. Past ceasefires, though, have gone largely ignored. Bastien Renouy gives us an update.
To urge the parties.
This declaration comes 2 weeks after a letter sent by General Burhan, the head of the Sudanese military, to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. In this letter, Burhan said that Volker Perthes, the head of the United Nations mission in Sudan, was not respecting the national sovereignty, and he accused him of presenting a misleading picture of consensus in his report to the United Nations. According to Burhan, without these signs of encouragement, General Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, would not have launched his military operations. At that time, Antonio Guterres said that he was shocked by the letter, but I can tell you that in Sudan, Volker Perthes was highly criticized by many people, even before this letter, before being declared persona non grata. At the beginning of the conflict, he said several times that it was impossible to predict that a war was going to happen between the RSF and the Sudanese military, despite the fact that many Sudanese and many international analysts were saying that there were raising tensions between the two men, between Burhan and Hemeti, and that there was a risk of escalation. That's not the only news of the day in Sudan. This Friday, the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces announced a new ceasefire. It's supposed to start at 6 a.m. on Saturday, and it will last for 24 hours. The goal is to bring humanitarian assistance in the most affected areas, such as Darfur and Khartoum. But I can tell you that in the Sudanese capital, many believe that there's not going to be any ceasefire, given that none of the previous ones were fully implemented, and given that during the past 3 days, the fighting have intensified in the capital. According to Médecins Sans Frontières, the French NGO, more than 150 people wounded by the conflict reached the hospital during the past 3 days, and many more were injured, but it's still very difficult for civilians to reach hospitals, given that many of them have been destroyed by the clashes, or many of them are still occupied by armed forces at the moment.
Bastien Renouy there for us. Now, more than 20 people have been killed in clashes in a displacement camp in South Sudan. Intercommunal violence between Shilluk and Nur communities erupted after a 14-year-old Shilluk boy was fatally stabbed at the Malakal site. It's home to more than 41,000 people, some of whom have recently fled the war in Sudan. South Sudan itself is still recovering from a 5-year civil war that officially ended in 2018, but continues to feed into outbreaks of ethnic violence, poverty, and social unrest. South African prosecutors have multiplied the number of charges against Rwandan genocide suspect Fulgence Kayishema. He'll now face 54 charges locally. That's up from a previous 5, and are all related to fraud and immigration offences, some which could carry up to 15-year sentences. Kayishema was arrested in South Africa in May. He was living under a false name after having been on the run since 2001. He could be extradited to Rwanda, as an international tribunal accuses him of having ordered the massacre of thousands at a church in Rwanda in 1994. The World Food Programme's following the US in suspending food aid to Ethiopia after finding massive theft of previous donations. The WFP's decision is temporary, and it says that it's boosting its monitoring of supplies. USAID, though, hasn't shared who was behind the diversions of food aid to Tigray, but says that it appeared to involve collusion between both sides in the conflict between the federal government and rebels from the northern region. The devastating two-year war ended in November, but the fallout continues. As well as sparking a vast humanitarian crisis, new figures suggest that over 100,000 people died, taking the world conflict-related death toll to a 28-year high. Clotilde Hazard has more.
55 conflicts have been recorded last year in the world, and almost half of them, 27 precisely, took place on the African continent. What's killing so many people last year is not the number of conflicts, but their intensity, especially the Ethiopian conflict in Tigray. Let's listen to Siri Asristad, director researcher taking part in the Uppsala conflict data program.
Compared to 2021, the battle-related deaths more than doubled. So in 2021, it was recorded 87,000. And in 2022, it was recorded 204,000. This is the highest number since 1984. It doesn't mean that the general conflict landscape has intensified, but we have a few really intense conflicts. And this year we had two. We had both Ukraine and Ethiopia.
Data collection for the conflict in Ethiopia has been particularly difficult because of the blocking of internet and the ban of journalists covering the conflict. The estimate of 100,000 battle-related deaths is primarily based on the NGO's work, and it doesn't count all the indirect casualties, those people who died of hunger and disease and lack of medical infrastructure. There is no official count, and the only independent assessment has been made at the end of 2022 by the Belgium University of Gand, estimating the number of deaths between 385,000 and 600,000. And even today, Tigray's authority reports that many civilians are still suffering and dying from the lack of food, one of the consequences of the conflict.
Clotilde Hazard there for us in Ethiopia. Now, the UN reckons that about 3 in 10 girls in Tanzania become child brides, despite the practice being deemed unconstitutional in 2016. Efforts since to change the laws allowing children to get married have been met with resistance. Caroline Lamberlet tells us more.
Sporting her signature motto on her T-shirt, "A girl with a dream is fire," girl rights activist Rebecca Gyumi spoke to a room of young schoolchildren in Dar es Salaam. She handed out sanitary pads and spoke to the children about gender equality. She's a leading voice in her country. In 2016, she filed a petition to scrap legislation that allows child marriage.
It's important to stop parents from allowing their girls to be married off at a young age. But it's even more important to push the government to issue a law which bans underage marriage.
In response to the petition, Tanzania's High Court issued a landmark ruling in 2016, raising the legal age of marriage for girls to 18. But the government never issued a formal ban, despite the High Court upholding its decision in 2019. The authorities recently said that the government was ready to start considering a bill amending the marriage law. But this has come up against resistance.
We faced a lot of challenges. Sometimes members of our community think Rebecca is working for foreign countries to destroy our norms. But we have to stand for our nation and fight against the local ideology, because we love our community and our nation.
According to the UN, around 3 in 10 girls in Tanzania are married during childhood.
And finally, a ruby from Mozambique has broken records in terms of both quality and price. Called the Estrela de Fura, the 55.22 carat gem is the largest of its kind to ever go under the hammer. The sale happened at Sotheby's in New York this week. The ruby was cut from a 101 carat rough stone found in Mozambique last year, before being sold for $34.8 million.
They said, boss, we are going to show you something which you have not seen in your life. I said, what? So they took a Zoom call, they put it on the ruby on the front of the camera, and I was like there standing there for 2 minutes, not believing what I've seen it.
Historically, rubies of this quality have come from Burma, today's Myanmar, but then to have this coming from Mozambique, we view this as really an inflection point for Mozambique rubies, bringing them much more awareness in the market for this just extraordinary quality. So to have something, any ruby really, over 50 carats is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But then to have one that's this large, with this amazing, rich, red, vibrant color, and the extraordinary clarity that it has, nothing like this has ever been seen before.
Fancy stuff. Well, that is, though, all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.